أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Associate Professor Muhammad Yahya Muhammad Arifin, Deputy Dean, Faculty of Leadership and Management, Honorable Professor Tan Sri Dato Zulkifli Abdul Razak, the Chair of Islamic Leadership, Mr. Ahmed Keeler, the speaker for today, representative from MITEM, Majlis Tindakan Ekonomi Malaysia, professors, doctors, lecturers, students, and ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, all praise is to Allah, who has given us mercies and blessings so that we can attend this important talk number 2 today without troubles and obstacles. I am Muhammad Mihlar, the MC of today's academic talk. On behalf of Faculty of Leadership and Management, USIM, I would like to welcome all to this remarkable academic talk, which is organized by Kursi of Islamic Leadership, Tuan Guru Haji Muhammad Yasin bin Muhammad. To start this academic talk, allow me to read the agenda of the program. The first opening by dua, followed by welcoming note by Honorable Professor Tan Sri Dato Zulkifli Abdul Razak. The next, the lecture by our distinguished guest, Da'i Sheikh Ahmed Keeler, followed by Q&A. Finally, closing by Kafaratul Majlis. Dear audience, ladies and gentlemen, to open this program, I would like to call upon Dr. Ahmed Najjar, Senior Lecturer of Aqidah and Religious Studies, Faculty of Leadership and Management, to recite dua. فَلْيَتَفَضَّلْ مَشْكُورًا.
الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد في الأولين والآخرين وسلم ورضي الله تبارك وتعالى عن ساداتنا أصحاب رسول الله أجمعين. حمدا حامدين، حمدا شاكرين، حمدا يوافي نعمه ويكافئ مزيده. يا ربنا لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك الكريم وعظيم سلطانك. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد طب القلوب ودوائها وعافية الأبدان وشفائها ونور الأبصار وضيائها وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم اغفر لنا وارحمنا ولآبائنا ولأمهاتنا ولإخواننا ولأخواتنا ولمشائخنا ولمعلمينا ذوي الحقوق علينا ولجميع المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات. اللهم اجعل جمعنا هذا جمعا مرحوما وتفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما، ولا تجعل اللهم فينا ولا معنا ولا من يتبعنا شقيا ولا مطرودا ولا محروما. هب لنا مسيئنا لمحسننا ومقصرنا لعاملنا، وهب لنا الكل لساعة جودك وإحسانك يا رب العالمين. اللهم اجعل أول يومنا هذا صلاحا وأوسطه فلاحا وآخره نجاحا. اللهم اجعل أوله رحمة وأوسطه زهادة وآخره تكريما. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. اللهم اقسم لنا من خشيتك ما تحول به بيننا وبين معاصيك، من طاعتك ما تبلغنا به جنتك، ومن اليقين ما يهون علينا مصائب الدنيا، ومتعنا بأسماعنا وأبصارنا وقوتنا ما أحييتنا، واجعله وارث منا، واجعل ثأرنا على من ظلمنا، وانصرنا على من عادانا، ولا تجعل مصيبتنا في ديننا، ولا تجعل الدنيا أكبر همنا ولا مبلغ علمنا، ولا تسلط علينا من لا يرحمنا يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم لا تدع لنا ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا هما إلا فرجته ولا كربا إلا فرجته ولا دينا إلا قضيته ولا حاجة إلا قضيتها ويسرتها يا رب العالمين. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. اللهم اختم لنا بحسن الخاتمة ولا تختم علينا يا الله بسوء الخاتمة. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. تقبل الله منكم.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed Najjar. Barakallahu Feek. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are pleased to welcome Da'i Sheikh Mr. Ahmed Keeler, a very special guest from Cambridge, UK. He will be sharing with us, inshallah, his expert opinion on Islam in the globalized world, reflections of an English Muslim. About the speaker, Ahmed Keeler is an Englishman who has converted to Islam in 1975. Currently lives and works in Cambridge. He was the principal organizer of the First World of Islam Festival in London in the 1970s. This was a seminal event that showcased the brilliant spectrum of Islamic civilization into the Western public imagination. He has lectured in different parts of the Muslim world on this topic. Over the last 10 years, he has been working with the team of specialists on the Golden Web project, which promises to catalyze public understanding and appreciation of Islamic civilization, both in the past and for the present. Ladies and gentlemen, tuan-tuan dan puan-puan. Now, let's come to the next agenda, which is welcoming notes. I cordially invite the Honorable Professor Tan Sri Dato Zulkifli Abdul Razak, the holder of the Tuan Guru Haji Muhammad Yasin bin Muhammad Chair of Islamic Leadership at the Faculty of Leadership and Management, USIM. Please welcome Honorable Professor Tan Sri Dato Zulkifli Abdul Razak.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Brother Ahmad, if I can just get your permission, I will speak to them in my language before I get into the English language, the colonial language, so that you're at home to start off with. Saya terlebih dahulu ingin mengucapkan ribuan terima kasih atas kehadiran yang begitu mengkagumkan, walaupun 90% agaknya adalah daripada kaum wanita dan siswi. Namun ini adalah satu sambutan yang cukup membanggakan. Soalnya kerana kita telah menjemput saudara Ahmed Keeler daripada Cambridge yang mempunyai latar sejarah penghidupan sebagai seorang Islam yang agak berbeza dengan kita. Kalau saya boleh ringkaskan penggembaraan beliau pada tahun sebelum 70-an, Ahmed Keeler dikenali sebagai Paul Keeler dan bertanggungjawab menyelenggarakan apa yang kita panggil pada ketika itu the World Festival of Islam, yang pertama sekali diadakan di Eropah, di London. Dan beliau adalah di antara tenaga yang besar untuk menyempurnakan festival tersebut, memperkenalkan Islam di Eropah khususnya. Dalam proses menyelenggarakan festival tersebut, beliau menjumpai Islam. He discovered Islam dalam proses sedemikian. Dan selepas daripada itu menjadi seorang Muslim yang sekarang ni mengambil nama Ahmed Keeler. Ini akan diceritakan pengembaraannya, his journey to Islam or to discovery of Islam will be the gist of his talk, at least the first half of it, supaya kita dapat berkongsi pengalaman beliau, kerana ini satu perkongsian yang kita tidak ada. Kita dilahirkan sebagai orang Islam dan kita merasakan bahawa itu adalah kepunyaan kita. Kita tidak ada lagi rujukan-rujukan selepas daripada itu. Sedangkan orang seperti Ahmed Keeler ataupun Paul Keeler mempunyai satu rujukan yang berbeza daripada kita, menjadi seorang bukan Islam dan mengembara ke masuk Islam. And this, I think, is an experience that all of us must share. All of us must realize, and all of us must to somehow or rather internalize within ourselves. That is the purpose of a lecture today. We have started Kerusi Kepimpinan Islam ini, a series daripada inspirasi Ahmed Keeler, a reflection of an English Muslim. Just about a month ago, we have got another lecture, a reflection of a Nigerian Muslim. Yeah? And selepas ini, we will have other invitees from New Zealand, from Singapore, from Myanmar, from Japan. The whole idea was basically to expose our minds to the different dimension of Islam in a different cultural context, in a different environment. And also to give you a flavor that Islam is a universal religion. It is not a religion of orang Melayu di Malaysia saja, yang lain misalnya tidak ada kaitan dengan kita. We need to open our mind to see Islam in that particular larger context. And these are the people who will probably, quote-unquote, educate us on what Islam is all about. Yeah? So, atas dasar itu saya mengharapkan bahawa hari ini akan ada satu interaksi yang aktif di antara beliau dengan kita. Menyelami sanubarinya, memahami apakah dia yang kita telah tidak jumpa dalam Islam sebagai seorang Muslim Melayu berbanding dengan beliau seorang Muslim yang berwarga negara British, ya. Dan bahagian kedua ceramah beliau adalah mengkritik apa yang dilihatnya di masyarakat beliau sendiri. Kita di negara timur selalu melihatkan Barat itu sebagai contoh yang hampir-hampir mutlak bagi kita. Ya, semalam dalam ceramah saya juga menyatakan sedemikian, model-model kita selalunya daripada Barat yang kita memikirkan inilah model yang paling baik. Saya tidak mengatakan Barat semuanya salah, tetapi orang Barat sendiri mempunyai satu persepsi dan kritikan tentang masyarakat mereka yang kita sendiri tidak faham kerana kita tidak memahami budaya mereka. Mereka lebih memahami budaya mereka dan mereka tahu di mana silapnya. Dan ini adalah satu kritikan yang saya rasa perlu kita sambut supaya kita juga mendalami dan memahami apa yang tidak kena di negara Barat yang kita perlu ketepikan dan asingkan, supaya kita jangan ambil semua sebagai contoh-contoh bagi kita, khususnya bagi anak-anak muda yang berinteraksi melalui internet, yang tidak melihat tetapi hanya mendengar, tidak merasakan tetapi hanya berinteraksi. Ini satu perkara yang saya rasa perlu kita awasi kerana dia boleh mendatangkan satu bentuk khayalan dari kita tentang apakah kenyataan yang berlaku di negara-negara tersebut. Yeah? So let me go back to the English language and welcome Brother Ahmed Keeler, someone who I have known quite coincidentally some years back. He was introduced to me by a friend that somehow or rather we have embraced one another as a kind of a brotherhood in Islam and share many concerns about what Islam and Muslim is all about, not only in our own country but of course internationally. From his own experience, he has tried to organize or reorganize his thoughts as far as what Islam is all about, given his experience, which I was telling them earlier, Ahmed, that this is something that we have not had the privilege of, that we would like to listen and share with you, and perhaps also internalize some of the experience so that we can become better Muslims also at the same time, with a role not only for Malaysia, but for the whole globalized world, given now the kind of turmoil we see in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in everywhere, that is pervading our mind, but yet we are not able to comprehend and understand it in the totality. So this is something that I would hope that this particular forum today will kind of lead us to some kind of an awareness in the long run, so that we can also develop a perspective that is useful for the generation to come, and particularly for this university, which to me is a very unique university that only takes students from religious studies and religious schools, but not yet needs to open our mind to the larger world around us if we were to make a difference. So on that note, I would like to welcome you again very warmly, and in fact we would like to keep you as long as possible in this university, but we also understand that you have been pulled and pushed by other people, but yet let us start this discussion, and maybe in time to come we will invite you again for further interaction between us and your good self. So on that note, welcome, and we look forward to your talk, and in fact we will also wish that you can enlighten us on what you have gone through, so that we can be part and parcel of your experience and your journey to Islam, which somehow we have not had the privilege to discover in one way or another. So thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Honorable Professor Tan Sri Dato' Zulkifli Abdul Razak, for your welcoming note. Ladies and gentlemen, without further delay, let me welcome our distinguished guest, Da'i Sheikh Ahmed Keeler, to deliver his lecture on Islam in a Globalized World, Reflections of an English Muslim. Please welcome Sir Ahmed Keeler.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. My goodness, this is a wonderful occasion for me to see so many bright faces. I've been in Malaysia now for a week, and I've had a wonderful time. And people have been very kind in allowing me to tell my story, and then for me to be able to reflect upon certain questions that have come out of my life and my story. So let me begin. The presentation I'm going to be giving you is in two parts. The first part is my journey to Islam, and the second part is certain reflections on the Western world, because obviously when I became a Muslim, I saw it in a very different light, and how I have understood Islam. Let us begin. Part one is called Changing Worlds. Now, I was born in 1942, and I was 18 in 1960. And during that period, my whole childhood came about at the time when the British Empire was completely still intact, so far as we were concerned in our education. I was born in Windsor. Now, Windsor was right at the heart of the empire. It's the favorite palace of the monarchs of England. And it was a magical place for a child to be brought up in. Right at the center of the town, there was the statue of Queen Victoria. Now, Queen Victoria had only been dead 40 years when I was born. But in Windsor, she was still very much alive. It was very much of a Victorian town. And as a child, you really wanted to go shopping with your mother, because every day they had the soldiers. They had the marching soldiers with their fantastic costumes and their bands playing. This is a picture of me when I was very young. And the reason I'm showing you this is because of the lady who is holding me. She was a wonderful person. She was a nurse who remained with our family. She died when she was 97, and she was a true Christian. She was a woman of remarkable beauty and love, and she instilled in me a great love as a child of Christianity. And the church meant a huge amount to me. This is me as a server at the age of 5. I used to serve in the church. Can you hear me, by the way? You can. Great. So I used to serve in the church. I was one of 5 children. We had 4 boys, and our sister was the eldest. And in this picture, you see me in the middle, sitting on my father's lap. I was number 3 of the boys. And as children, we came from a well-off family, but all our holidays, all our life was in England. We never went abroad. And for holidays, we used to go camping. And we used to ride horses, and we used to go swimming. And it was during my childhood, we had some very cold winters in England at the time. So there was a lot of snow around. We had tremendous fun. But it was a very happy family. And the wealth of the home which we had was a beautiful house with a glorious garden. And the garden was my mother's joy. And it was just a paradise. Now that paradise was supported, our whole way of supported was by my father's factory, because he was an industrialist. And if you look at the right, just at the right of the house, you'll see gates going into what used to be the stables, and which were now offices. Because at the bottom of our garden, there was a great factory producing optical instruments. That was the source of the wealth, which meant that we were able to have a wonderful, very protected childhood. However, at the age of 8, that was about to change. Because at the age of 8, members of our class went to prep school. Now, prep schools in those days were not like the kind of schools that you are familiar with. These were very, very disciplined and ferocious places. I'll give you just 2 incidents of the discipline. We were only allowed 2 blankets on our bed. And we slept in very large dormitories, 14, 15 of us in a dormitory. And summer and winter, the windows were kept open and there was no heating. And in the middle of the dormitory, they had water jugs, which we used for cleaning our teeth. And in the winter, and I was just saying that we had some very ferocious winters during my childhood, the water used to ice over. And the beds were freezing. It was a real torture. But we were being trained to be able to put up with practically anything. The parents were terribly impressed, because in chapel, the children sat like statues. They didn't move. That was a very good reason. The headmaster had a little book, and if a boy started to move around a bit, the name would go in the book. If the name went in 3 times, the boy would be caned. And believe you me, it wasn't just a caning. None of this business of keeping a book under your arm and like that. No, no, no. This was real thrashing. And the children would come out with blood on their, having blood. It was very ferocious. But it was all for a purpose. It was all for a purpose. We were taught about gentle Jesus and the whole Christian message. But we were also taught about Julius Caesar and the Romans. And in my childhood, Jesus Christ on the one hand and Julius Caesar on the other hand were the two most powerful figures. You could not imagine two more opposite people. We were deeply, deeply embroiled in the heroes of England. We were told the stories. Alfred the Great, a very powerful story. Alfred the Great, who in the 8th century was fighting the Vikings. He lost the battle. He had to go and seek refuge. He goes into a peasant's hovel, the hovel of a farmer. And the farmer's wife is there. And she doesn't know this is the king. And she's baking some cakes. And she says, "You can come in, but sit down and watch the cakes. I've got to go and get some wood." The king is thinking of his kingdom. He's thinking about what's to be done. How can I recover my kingdom? And the cakes begin to burn. Back comes the lady, furious, and she starts beating the king. And then the husband comes in and sees the guy. "Ah, don't! This is the king." And that story was emblazoned on one's memory. Then there was the great story of Drake. Drake, who was the captain or the admiral of the fleet when in the 16th century the Armada, the Spanish, were attempting to invade England with their great fleet. And the fleet is sighted, and the smoke goes up, and the messenger comes, and Drake is playing bowls. And he says, "We've got to go. The Armada has arrived. We've got to get into the ships." And Drake says, "Calm down. We'll finish the game of bowls, and then we'll defeat the Spanish." And then there's the story of General Wolfe. And the reason why Canada today is English and not French is because the French were up on this plateau. And the side of the mountain was so steep that the French didn't believe that there was any possibility that an army could be taken up that side of the mountain. And General Wolfe, before breakfast, took the whole of the British army up, surprised them, and won the battle. And Canada became British. And finally, the death of Nelson. Admiral Lord Nelson. Again, in terms of the battle, is against our old enemy, the French. He died in the battle and became the great hero of England. And we knew his story. We knew all about his life and his story. And these were the great heroes, the great English heroes that we were taught about. And then, of course, you must remember, this was the 1950s. And we'd only just come out of the World War, the Second World War. And we were reliving the World War through a whole series of war films that were coming out. And these war films showed the heroism of the British. We'd won the war practically on our own. We never heard about the Indian troops or the African troops, all the other troops from the Empire. We only heard about the English and a Scotsman now and again. But the heroism of these people, the Americans came in late. And I was an adult when I discovered that the Russians had lost 20 million people on the Eastern Front. We weren't taught about the Eastern Front. We were taught about the great English heroes. One of them was a gentleman called Douglas Bader, the one top right. And he lost his legs in the First World War, but insisted, without legs, that he would fly in the Second World War. And we as children, because this film was a tremendous success, we as children used to go around pretending that we had tin legs. It's incredible the impact this had on us. And then, of course, there were the sports. And the sports were football, rugby, cricket, athletics, and all sports which had been developed in this system, that had been organized. Football and rugby used to be one game. It used to be a game where you just had a ball and you had to get to the other end, however you could do it. And then they formalized it into one where you kicked the ball and the other way you threw it. And all of this was being done in these schools. Because what was the purpose of these schools? To provide the administrators, the churchmen, the bishops, the judges, the legal people, and the soldiers of empire. To train people who could go anywhere in the world and be at home, in terms of the fact that they would never leave England. They would always be in their own world, but they could survive anywhere. And this system was based upon the Spartan system consciously in the 19th century. Because as the British Empire grew, what happened was that there was a lot of corruption that started to happen. People used to come back from the East India Company, going out as clerks, coming back as millionaires. So they needed to create a class which served the state. And the Spartans knew that if you took a child of 8 and you took them from 8 to 18, you could turn them into servants of the state. And that is what was being created. Now, that is the result of the education. And I can assure you that is exactly how I felt when I was 10 years old. No question. After all, the British had the greatest empire the world had ever known. We'd surpassed the Romans. We were the creators of the Industrial Revolution. We had a sensible form of Christianity, not that rather silly form that the Italians and the Irish had. We had the Church of England. Of course, we were absolutely the peak of human civilization. We didn't have to proclaim it like the Germans. We knew it. And believe you me, that was really embedded in our being. Now, when I was 10 years old, a very important moment happened, and that was that the King of England, King George VI, died. And it was a devastating moment for us because he was a very popular king, and he was a good man. And when it was announced, the headmaster came into the dining room. I can remember to this day exactly what I was eating. It was one of those moments of huge importance. And then the next year, Queen Elizabeth was crowned. And this is the first time I saw television. I'd grown up in the pre-television age. And this is the first time I saw television. And it was the first time the nation had television. Because the coronation was televised. And we were beginning to enter a new realm. Now, I went on then to a public school, which was a Christian foundation, and a very enlightened place. It was very different from my prep school. It encouraged music, it encouraged art, it encouraged theatre. It was a very civilized and civilizing place. The chapel was an extraordinarily beautiful building around which the whole life revolved. We had services in the morning, we had services in the evening. When we, our last year, our housemaster took us on the tour of Italy, like the Grand Tour. We went to Florence, Venice, Siena, Assisi, seeing all these remarkable places. And so by the age of 18, I had been through this whole process of an education preparing me for a particular role in life. There was only one problem, and that was, basically I was out of a job because the empire had finished. The empire was over. By the age of 18, I couldn't come to Malaysia. I couldn't go to India. I couldn't go to Nigeria. I couldn't go to anywhere because the British Empire had gone. But very often education lags behind the reality of what you're actually engaged in. My brother was the last who completed the complete education because he went into the army. And the army, the national service, was abolished when I was 18 in 1960. I was the first generation not to go into the army. But my brother did. And what happened was that he arrived, 6 weeks basic training. Then they took the people who came from my education into the officer training. During that 3 months of officer training, the young men would grow their moustache. You'll see my brother in the middle with the hat has got a moustache. They would then be given their platoon. You may wonder why so many of these people in the Middle East, like Saddam Hussein, have moustaches. It's Sandhurst. It's the British Army. This was the tradition. The officer had a moustache. And this is the first of the extraordinary things in my life. Because one of the things that the prep school taught you, it taught you to conform and make the very best of wherever you found yourself. The human being has an amazing capacity to adapt and to be able to make the best of things. And we did. We did. So if I had gone into the army, my life would have been a completely different life. I'd have come out quite a different, on a different trajectory. But I didn't go into the army. Oh no. It was the 1960s. And in 1960s England, something was beginning to shake. Because this very organized, ordered, very rigid society, very class-structured society, was about to go through a trauma. Because with the collapse of empire, this came home to England in a very big way. Now, I had a problem, because the only thing I was good at school was theatre. I loved the plays, and I was very, very fortunate, because when I arrived at my public school, they were doing Hamlet, and I auditioned and I got a part for Hamlet. If you look at the, can you see these? Are these clear? If you look at this little line at the bottom here, you'll find a very lovely looking lady. That was me playing Ophelia. And it was how it was done in Shakespeare's day. That's how it was done in Shakespeare's day. But by the end of that play, I knew the play by heart. It was my first great education. Then we did The Firstborn, which is about Moses. And I played Moses. And my final play at Lancing was Dr. Faustus. And these were all great classics. Dr. Faustus was by Marlowe. It's a 16th century play. Magnificent language. And a play of an extraordinary vision. The vision is that Faustus makes an agreement with Shaitan. And he says to Shaitan, if you give me everything I want, when I die, I will give you my soul. So what he says, what happens is that the first thing he wants is knowledge. He wants to grasp and take all the knowledge that he can get, so that it gives him power. Then the second thing he wants all the spices and the fruits and the jewels from everywhere in the world. And they come to him. They come to him. And then he wants every lady that he can lay his hands on, both living and those that will be brought back to life, like Helen of Troy. Doesn't this sound a little bit familiar? It's a very Western world. Everything coming to your table, the supermarkets, you've got everything. But of course at the time, I didn't know any of this. I just enjoyed the plays. I just enjoyed the plays. So it was decided that I should go to drama school. And this is where the next extraordinary coincidence took place. Because at that time in London, there were two drama schools. There was the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and there was a Central School of Speech and Drama. And the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art was a very conservative, Shakespeare-based theatre company, theatre school. And if I'd gone to that, again, my life could have been very different. I may even still have been in the theatre. But instead, I went to the other school. I was invited to the other school. And the other school, it was the first year in which the new drama was introduced. And it became the drama school for the new theatre. And this was the theatre and the dramatists who were tearing down the old establishment. These were the dramatists who were tearing down the religion, tearing down the hierarchies, tearing down all those traditional aspects of family. It was a huge eruption of anger and destruction. And I spent 3 years doing these plays, going home at the weekends, staying at home during the holidays. But this was where I was working. This was my work. But by the end of it, something had gone out of me. I didn't realize it particularly at the time, but if you look at these photographs, which are my audition photographs, my soul has somehow died. I'd forgotten all about Almighty Allah, or God. I wasn't interested. I was just engaged with what was going on at the time. It had really had quite an eroding effect upon me. And I was no longer interested in the theatre. I'd lost that interest. Now, when I was 21, this is when I was 21, my parents gave me the money to go to France as my 21st birthday present. And there, I encountered another world. And this was the world of art. And the world of art in Paris, and then in the south of France. And I was meeting these artists and seeing the people who've been like Van Gogh and Gauguin, and all this beautiful art. I was so excited by it, and this became my new world. And when I got home, I put on an exhibition in my father's house, in our family house. This is the hall of the family house. And I then announced to my father that I wanted to open an art gallery. At that time, modern art was very small in England, in London. And this gentleman was the person who was the major promoter of modern art. His name was Sir Rowland Penrose, and he was the biographer of Picasso and Miro, and he had all their he was friends with all the artists, and he built a huge collection of their art. And every time the institute which he formed, the Institute of Contemporary Arts he formed, he would sell a painting to support the institute. That was how fragile it was. And that was their gallery. It was a very small gallery. I had convinced my father to give me one of his shops in London, right in the centre of London. This was on the corner of Wigmore Street and Welbeck Street, right in the middle of London. A 4-story shop, which became the biggest avant-garde gallery in London. At that time, pop art was the big thing. The Americans were very much dominant with their pop art. What I went in for was kinetic art. Kinetic art. This was the art of movement, the art where light went across paintings, surfaces, movement, magnetic movement, all these things. Because what one was trying to do, one was trying to connect art and science and technology. The gallery put on big one-man shows, and it was very interesting because most of the artists were South Americans living in Paris who had a very strong connection with Moorish Spain, with their Spanish heritage, because they were interested in the geometric patterns and the geometric designs. And this was the first time I just had a little introduction into the Islamic. We used to produce a newspaper. And here I am standing next to one of my father's machines, which could have been a work of art. Because again, it was this whole idea of connecting art and science. However, the cost was enormous. And I only had one collector. So one day my father looked at the books and he said, "You're going to ruin us. You're going to ruin us." And he closed the gallery. It had lasted for 2.5 years. And it had become very well known in London. And then I experienced going very high and coming down very low immediately. And by the age of 25, I thought my life was over. The gallery had become my religion. It had become my whole life. And I was in a terrible state of depression. And this was 1967. And things were stirring in America. Something was happening in America amongst the youth. You'll be familiar with this. Yes, this was the moment when the youth of America rebelled against the hierarchy because of the Vietnam War. And they said, "No more war. We want peace. We want to enjoy ourselves. We want to be ourselves. We don't want this kind of world that you adults have created. This bleak, dark, cruel world. We want to create our own world." And you've got this huge movement. This is the Maharishi, because they went to the East. They'd lost interest in their own world. The Maharishi at Woodstock. More than 1 million people. More than 1 million people. When it came to England, it took on a slightly different bent because we didn't have a war. But again, we had a society that was very rigid, and the youth wanted to be free of it. They wanted to be free. And it expressed itself very much through music. And what you had was you had this huge industrial music, this massive sound, which started, plugging the guitar into the electrics and producing this tremendous industrial sound. And then the lights creating this overwhelming experience. And then in order to complete it, a little bit of a substance. A pill of some sort, which would finally give you this sense of absolutely being overwhelmed and being in touch with very exciting things. Well, I had a house, and within a very short time, there were 70 people living in it. I had my own tribe. But we were working. We were creating a whole, we called it the exploding galaxy. And we created this whole world of happenings, of theatrical events, of musical events in the streets, in the parks, on buses. And this whole world was one which the ordinary people didn't like it. Would you like to live beside a house where there are 70 people living in it? But we didn't realize we were so selfishly obsessed with our world. And here I am, looking like a very sad Moses at this particular time. And this whole world of the hippie was beginning to sour. It was beginning to fall apart because the tribes that we had weren't able to be sustained, and there was no proper structure. And this is where the next miracle occurred. The next moment when my life was completely changed. And this was when I entered into this last phase of my life. And that was that there were two really important meetings. The first is I met my wife. And we had 4 children. We now have 7 grandchildren. And that half of my life was completed. The second is my wife and I went to a concert. We were invited to a concert of North Indian classical music. And we met a remarkable man from Delhi, Ustad Mahmud Mirza. And he introduced us to a completely new world. A world of beauty, a world of order, a great art form which combined art and science and life and art. Everything was integrated and placed and took one to a point of peace, a very deep and a very scientific form. And he was from a Mughal background. He was an aristocratic man. And he started introducing us to Islam in the most subtle ways. I remember once we were on a bus, and we were sitting on a bus. I suddenly got the sense that he didn't believe in the theory of evolution. So I said to him, "But don't you believe we came from apes?" And he said, "Well, you may have done, but I certainly didn't." And it was the sort of subtlety of the way in which he was introducing us to another world. We all wanted to go to India at that time, but India had come to us. So instead he said, "Go to America." And I went to America, and I organized a tour of music, of his music, which ended up at Brandeis University. And at Brandeis University, I did this little presentation, this little festival, in which I placed the music within its court cultural setting, within its Mughal setting. And then, when I got back to London, I had the great and the only inspiration of my life, which was the following. I had been introduced to Moorish Spain, to Islam in Spain, through my gallery. And Mahmud had introduced me to Mughal India. And I could see that these two worlds were the same world. They were the same world. And Ibn Battuta could be born in Tangier, be trained in Tangier, he could travel to Delhi, and he could practice as a Maliki lawyer, as a Maliki judge. It was the same world of art, the same world of calligraphy, the same hierarchical knowledge. And yet, nothing connected them excepting Islam. They were culturally, ethnically, and in every other way completely separate. They had absolutely nothing which connected them other than Islam. So I was so excited about this that I wanted to communicate it. So I went to my friends at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. And if you remember, the last time we met the Institute of Contemporary Arts, they were in that little flat. Now they'd moved to these magnificent new premises. And the director was very happy with the idea. And we put on a little festival, the World of Islam Festival. It was 1971, and it was a small event focused on geometric pattern, because this is something that people could relate to, they could understand. And we had lectures and seminars, and it was very successful. It was well received by the press, and it was well attended. But there was only one problem, and that was that 6 months before the festival took place, the director of the institute came to me, and he said, "Paul, I'm very sorry, but the Arts Council have withdrawn certain of our grants, and we can't pay for the event." So I had to raise the money, but when the project took place, I was £10,000 short. And £10,000 in those days was a huge amount of money. So I was in a real dilemma. What was I to do? And it so happened that this was at the end of 1971. In January of 72, my brother got married in Switzerland. And I went to Switzerland a week earlier. And I went up and stayed in a place in the mountain because I was in real trouble. I was in a situation where I could go bankrupt. So I asked myself the question, is this idea of the World of Islam Festival a good idea? You must remember, I'm not a Muslim yet. And the answer that came back was yes. But the answer that came back said, however, if you do it, you have to do it at the top level. You have to engage all the major British institutions. You have to do it through all the media of exhibition, of television, of publication, of seminar, of lecture. And Her Majesty the Queen must open it. And I said to my voice, really, you think that's the thing? And he said, that's it. So I came back to London, and I went straight to the Arts Council of Great Britain, to friends there, and I put to them the idea that if we did this festival, would they do the Arts of Islam, the centerpiece exhibition? And they said, it's a very good idea. We like the idea, but we only have one big problem, and that is that the chairman of our exhibitions committee doesn't like Islamic art. And if we put it before the committee and he turns it down, that's it, finished. We can't resubmit it. But, they said, he will be finished in a year, and we get a new chairman, and that chairman will be amenable, and we'll be able to get it through. So I had to wait a year. So what did I do? I went to the other institutions. I went to the Science Museum, and I said to the Science Museum, if the Arts Council do the exhibition of the arts, will you do the sciences of Islam? And then the British Library, will you do the Holy Quran? And then the Museum of Mankind, will you do Nomad and City? And gradually I got all of their interest. And then I went to the BBC. And the BBC had just done the first of the great documentary film series, Civilization. And I proposed to them a great series on the world of Islam. The world of Islam. And they considered it, and they turned it down. And do you know why they turned it down? They turned it down because they said there simply would not be enough interest. Islam was not even on the radar. There was absolutely no interest, there was no concern. Nobody knew anything about it. It wasn't an issue. Can you imagine? During my short life, Islam has gone from, in terms of our country, from not being an issue to being the biggest of issues. The biggest of issues. So, I waited the year, the Arts Council agreed and put their biggest gallery for the exhibition, and all the other institutions agreed, and we had the largest presentation of a culture ever to have taken place in England, and probably in the West. Many scholars participated in the project. We had over 100 scholars engaged. The festival took place in 1976, as planned, and Her Majesty the Queen opened it. And the statistics are incredible. 6,000 objects were brought together from 36 different countries, from 150 different collections. It was an amazing array, the number of books and films and all the things which were produced. And here I am, very recently, handing over to the head of Arabic at Cambridge University the 5 volumes of press cuttings, because there was a huge press coverage of the event. And of course, the press coverage of the event is now of great interest, because it's historical. It shows a cross-section of exactly how Islam was perceived in 1976. But what was more important is that the festival had an amazing impact on a lot of people. But most important for me was it was my journey to Islam, because 6 months before the festival opened, I became a Muslim. 7 years from the time we met Ustad Muhammad Mirza. It took 7 years, because I came through the culture. I came through organizing that event. This was my journey. And when people ask me, how did you become a Muslim? I always tell them it was through music, food, and friendship. Because what happened was it was the beauty, the truth, and the goodness of Islam. I found myself surrounded by Muslims. All my friends were Muslims. It just gradually happened, you know, as I was organizing the festival. It just gradually happened. And then suddenly I found myself at a point where I realized that if I didn't take this step, I would end up like Lawrence of Arabia, totally schizophrenic. And I wanted to be whole. I wanted to be whole. And alhamdulillah, I was able to start that process of becoming whole. 1976, at the end of, I made my Hajj and became a part of the Ummah. And that British, that English sense of being so very important was beginning to disappear. Beginning to disappear. Alhamdulillah, during my life I think that has disappeared, in the sense that I don't think that I had the depth of the feeling that Malcolm X had when he went on Hajj. He came from the exclusivity of the black in America. I came from the exclusivity of the white Englishman of a particular class in England. And it was incredible suddenly to see the whole world in white. And the emotion around the Kaaba. I couldn't have that emotion. I had emotion, but you can't believe how that emotion had been held in from one's education. But it was a beautiful moment. So the people, because my Islam didn't come through seeking the truth. It didn't come through wanting to find a religion. It came through the culture. It came through the masters, the traditional masters. And the first, of course, was my dear friend Ustad Muhammad Mirza, who over 45 years I have seen what a traditional form is. A traditional form which is like an ocean. The deeper you go, the deeper it is. It goes on and on. You can never exhaust it. The second person who was of enormous importance to me was Abdul Wahid al-Wakil, the great architect. And he was the disciple of Hassan Fatih, who was the reviver of Islamic architecture in Egypt. It had practically disappeared. And this man, Hassan Fatih, revived it. And Abdul Wahid al-Wakil carried out and has produced some of the most beautiful buildings, following the natural materials. This beautiful mosque in Jeddah, and then the rebuilding of Quba, the first mosque of Islam, the rebuilding of the mosque of the two Qiblas, Qiblatain, the fantastic Miqat, the great center when you're going into Medina. Glorious, glorious architecture, all within the tradition. Bringing together the crafts, creating human spaces where the human being can breathe and be inspired. Such beautiful, beautiful things. And then there was another person, very surprisingly, who introduced me to the glory of the tradition. And this was an agriculturalist called Tony Milroy. And he was sent out as a young man to the Yemen when it was opened up in the early 1970s. He was a young man. And he was sent out by the British Development Agency to see how we could help them in their development. And he arrived, and he went to North Yemen, where they have the great mountain terraces and the valleys. And after a month being with the people, being with the farmers, he said, "Look, I have nothing to teach you. Please teach me." And he then spent 4 years understanding this incredible system that he was witnessing. Because he was experiencing one of the great masterpieces of human creation. These terraces, carved out of the mountain, covering every inch that could be farmed, and taking the water so that the water, when the monsoon hit the top of the mountain, the water would then be channeled through the terraces, fertilizing the crop. And as it came into the great valleys, the fields would be dammed, and then once the water had sunk into the field, the dam would be opened, and the water would flood into the next field. And the children would have an absolute wonderful time, using them like water rafts. And finally, when the water had gone right through the valley, the crop would be there. And he, after 4 years, came back, and the report that he gave was the following. He said, "These people have been farming for thousands of years. They have developed a system which is continually being improved. They have hundreds of different varieties of sorghum for every ecological niche. They harvest every drop of water for their crop." He was there during the Ethiopian famine, but it didn't affect the Yemen. They had the same problem in terms of water. But they knew how to manage famine. They knew if the water didn't come one week, you plant another crop. You plant another crop. You know, they understood how to manage it. And he said, this system is completely integrated into their way of life and into their religion. Nothing is done without the name of God. And he said, they transmit the tradition through epic poetry. It's all the knowledge is memorized in poetry, in poetic form. And he said, this system is one which will last forever, is completely sustainable, and there's only one way we can help them, and that is leave them alone and don't interfere with them. And you can imagine the agency was absolutely furious. We've paid for you for 4 years to go out there, and you're coming back to tell us there's nothing we can do to develop them? So what he did, being a very interesting man, he went to all the other arid land areas like Australia and areas of America and studied these systems. And then 10 years later, he went back to Yemen with a camera. And this is what he found. Because everything he had warned against had happened. The first thing that happened was that the Americans and the Europeans, using their way of putting a hook in for trade, had flooded the Sana'a market with subsidized wheat, which had undercut the sorghum growers on the terraces. The sorghum growers couldn't make a living, so that you started to get the great diaspora of Yemenis from that difficult land of the mountains. And they went into the oil fields of Arabia, and they went as far as California. You will find the Yemeni farmers in the orange groves of California. If you don't maintain the terraces start to collapse. And here you see on the left a collapsing terrace. And what you see on the right is a wadi, a valley, that is 10 meters in rubble. A fertile piece of land that is complete rubble. And then the development agencies were saying, why wait for the monsoon? You've got groundwater. Go down into the ground. And Yemen now has, they think, between 10, 11, 12 years left of groundwater. The groundwater is being sucked out so quickly. And then, you know, the Yemenis used to have this thing called kat, a little bush, which in the evening they take a few leaves and take it as a sort of little stimulant in the evening, so when they had discussions, etc. Now, where sorghum used to be grown, kat is grown industrially with chemicals and fertilizers. And that kat is water hungry, and 70% of the water of Yemen is going into growing that kat. And because it's industrially grown, because it is chemicalized, the people are suffering from terrible mouth cancers. And now they are addicted. If you are in Sana'a about 12 o'clock in the day, you see people driving like mad to get home, and in their cheek is just going, and they're a paradise, in the sense that a place which was completely, totally perfect for what it required to be done. It worked perfectly. Almighty Allah was worshipped. The whole culture was together. And most important of all, the land that Almighty Allah has given us was fertile, was healthy, was good, and provided them with whatever they needed. And now this. So this taught me something very important. Things can be perfect. Things can be perfect. We're told that they've got to evolve, they've got to change, they've got to change, they've got to change. No, 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 no. Certain things can be absolutely perfect. The final example I want to give to you, to the way in which I have understood Islam, was my son, Ali, my third son, Ali, who was a musician. He's a person who loves music. And he was learning classical violin from the age of 6. And then when he became a teenager, he fell in love with recitation, with tajweed. He used to get all the cassettes of the Egyptians, the great Egyptians, and listen to them. And then one day he came to me and he said, "Dad, I want to go to Damascus and learn how to do tajweed properly." And I said to him, "That's wonderful. How do you think you'll get on?" And he said, "Oh, it should be all right. I mean, I'm a musician. I mean, I can hear the notes. I can play Mozart and Beethoven. You know, I mean, it's recitation. It shouldn't be so difficult." I said, "Fine." 10 years later, in our house, Sheikh Abdul Razak gave him his ijazah for recitation, for tajweed. And I asked him, I said, "Ali, do you remember that conversation we had 10 years ago?" And he said, "Yes, Dad." I said, "How does it look now?" And he said, "I'll tell you. There's a ladder, a very high ladder. And right at the top of that ladder is my sheikh. And I've put my foot on the first rung of that ladder." Because he had understood. He'd been initiated into a great mystery that is nothing to do with knowing the notes. It's receiving it through the heart. It's knowing every single one of those words. And it's being in a position where it actually becomes realized in the heart, not in the head. And that's what he had learnt. Because this is why the great reciters, when they recite, we receive barakah from them. We receive this glorious barakah because they are become these great transmitters. The great transmitters of the sacred. But he knew he was on the first rung of a ladder which went up and up and up and never ending, an ocean. And this is what I have learnt. Islam, the tradition, the great tradition, is an ocean. Vast, vast. So let us revisit the maelstrom. Because in the 1960s, I experienced 3 worlds which were in their infancy. So let us start with the world of the theatre. Well, of course, the angst, the tearing apart, the social chaos is now on all your screens. Every soap opera, every film is dealing with human misery. Parents shouting at each other, children shouting at their parents. This is common now. You turn on the television in England and somebody's going and beating it. I had a friend of mine who's told me a story. He said, "I was leaving my house one day." He lived in a terraced house. And a neighbor called out, "Terrible about Moira," and then ran for the bus. And he spent the whole day thinking, who the hell is Moira? Who's Moira? And he got back at home that night, and he said to his wife, "Our neighbor said something terrible's happened to Moira. Do we know anybody called Moira?" And she said, "Oh no, that's the character in the new soap opera. The husband's gone and taken a hatchet to her." So suddenly we're in a world in which Remember, I grew up without television. We're in a world in which people are more engaged with the characters in those stories than they are with the members of their own family. Why? Because the intensity of those experiences when you go to see a film, or you look at, it's huge. Whereas life relationships are slow burning, are slow. So it's like being on a drug. Now people are living in the media rather than living in life. Let us look at the avant-garde. Let us look at what happened to the world of art. Well, that has really exploded. In London now, this power station has been turned into the biggest modern art gallery in the world, and it is the second largest tourist attraction in London after the British Museum. In 1998, there were 2 exhibits which created a tremendous stir. A shark in a case, a plastic case. It was bought by an American collector for $7 million. And an artist called Tracy Amin, who had had a very bad breakup with her boyfriend, had been depressed, had been lying in her bed, had been doing all the horrible things which a certain type of person will do. And she got out of bed one day and she'd looked at her bed and she'd phoned up her agent and she'd said, "I've got a new work of art." And the agent said, "What's that?" She said, "My bed." And he said, "That's brilliant. Nobody's thought of that before. That is great." And he said, "I'll buy it for £150,000. That was in 1998. 3 months ago, it was sold at Sotheby's for £2.2 million. And it's now called an icon of modern art. It's an icon of modern art. The artist has been honored by Her Majesty the Queen. She is a companion of the British Empire. The British Empire doesn't exist anymore, but we still have the honors. And when our Prime Minister, David Cameron, arrived at Downing Street, he was given the whole of the government's collection of art to choose a work from, and he chose one by this artist, stating that she was his favorite artist. What about my artists? My goodness me. These works I used to own. I would be a multi-millionaire now if I'd still owned them. I wouldn't be here talking with you. But thank goodness, alhamdulillah, that I did not own them. I thank Almighty God every day of my life that my father closed the gallery. Because if he hadn't, can you imagine what would have happened to my life? Because my artist is so famous now, I'm continually being invited to talk and to give lectures and things. And I say, look, it finished when I was 25. You know, it's a part of, it's no longer a part of my life. And I don't want to go and tell them what I think. But while I was preparing this talk, one of my artists had a huge exhibition at Tate Modern. And they invited me again, and I had to go, just to see what that world was. And I entered this world which was just like a cult. These rich collectors, all these critics, artists, you know, and everything. And they were creating this artist, they were canonizing this artist, they were putting this artist into the immortals. And I was a minor celebrity. They said to me, "We understand that you were in Rio and that you went to her studio and you spent a whole day with her. Please, can you tell us about this? Can you give us a talk on this?" To tell you the truth, I don't even remember the occasion. But this is the insanity. But let us look at the most interesting one of all. what's happened? What has happened to the hippies? Well, the greatest rave that has ever taken place, something that in the 60s we couldn't even begin to compare with, took place on Her Majesty's Jubilee in front of Buckingham Palace around the Victoria Monument, where all the noise and the lights and the gyrating ladies created an unbelievable sound. All the old rockers who are now Sir this and Sir that, and presiding over all of it was Her Majesty the Queen and her court. Now, Her Majesty the Queen can't stand the noise, so she puts in earplugs. But bobbing up and down to the music, like this, bobbing up and down to the music, was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the next day, he was in St. Paul's Cathedral giving a sermon to the gathered. How could this insanity take place? How could this madness occur? Now, I have really tested your indulgence and tested your patience. And I do hope that my journey has been of some little interest, because, in fact, it sets the scene for another 40 minutes in which I attempt to answer the question, why this madness? How could this madness have happened? But I don't know whether we're going to have time for it, are we? Or what? Little break? Absolutely. We need a little break. So if we have a little break, and then I would love to be able to communicate to you with how I understand this madness, because it is a complete insanity. Thank you very much.
Just boleh saya rumuskan sedikit apa yang diceritakan tadi, pengalaman dia, dan the next phase is mengapa ini berlaku. I think that's the most important phase, given all the background that Paul or Ahmed has gone through. This is something that we have gone through also. At least saya sebagai orang tua, the hippie phase is all my phase. The rock and roll phase is all my phase. And I think you're experiencing also the same phase, but in a different way. Your internet, your social media, your whatever it is. Now, he's questioning mengapa ini berlaku, dan dalam konteks dunia barat dia akan menjawab. Dia mungkin memerlukan lagi setengah jam untuk menerangkan, tapi dia nak break, dia nak pergi ke bilik air. Can you just stay on for a while, then we have the Q&A. Yeah? So I've just explained it to you. Maybe we can go to your, and then we'll come back. No, let him go. But this is the very important part. The answer to the question.
We set up the scene now.
After that, we'll open the session for Q&A.
Yeah.
You want to do it all right?
Very good. So we start. Part 2 is three worlds. In order to understand Western civilization, one has to realize that it is not one world, it is three worlds. Look at these three buildings: the Christian, the civilized, and the modern. And these three worlds are completely separate They had their own cultures. They had their own education. The Christian world. Christianity came to England at the same time that the Prophet Muhammad came to the Arabs. So we have a parallel evolution. And he came to England through the saints. This is St. Augustine and St. Columba. One came from the south, the other came from the north. And they were converting a simple, tribal, farming people that had recently conquered from the Germanic world. And they brought with them a complete culture, a complete Christian culture which was centered upon the saint. And this is St. Thomas a Becket, who was martyred. And he was the primary saint of England, and he was buried in Canterbury Cathedral. And then there was St. Cuthbert, who was the great saint of the north, and he was buried in Durham. And just look at the scale of that building. And look at the very modest size of the town around it. Christianity, the spiritual, was absolutely dominant. And of course it was the saints. The saints in Christianity were the monks. They were the professionals. They were the ones who absolutely, completely focused their whole lives on following the way of Christ, which was celibate. They were celibate, they were poor, and they lived in community. This is St. Dunstan, Ely. And these cathedrals were not like mosques which were built in decades. These cathedrals took more than 100 years to build. The people who started building them never saw them completed. And at the center of them was the saint, because pilgrimage was the major activity in terms of why people traveled. Look at the ascent to heaven. Look at the way these buildings aspire. And all the art and the beauty was formed within these buildings. And then, in the period of 30 years, it all came crashing down. Henry VIII abolished the core of Christianity, the monasteries, and nearly 1,000 buildings were destroyed. The whole heart of Christianity, all the art, all the culture, all the great buildings were destroyed. Nearly 1,000 buildings. There's nothing like it that has ever happened on earth, because other cultures have destroyed other cultures. But for a culture itself to destroy its own center is quite extraordinary. So what was left? Everywhere you go in England, you find these ruins. Huge abbeys, monasteries, which are the scale of cathedrals, destroyed. And what was left was a Christianity of a book translated into English, no art, everything whitewashed, no culture. What happened next was really strange. Because having made a ruin of their own culture, the Europeans then worshipped, dug up and worshipped a world that had been dead for 1,000 years. Dug it up and worshipped it. Started to commune with a dead world. Using their imagination, because you know, if you are talking to somebody who's dead, you have to use your imagination. You don't get anything back. They then created these museums in which they went and dug up statues without arms or with bits of the head missing, columns of statues, and dusted them off very carefully and put them in these new shrines, these new temples. All over Europe, the British went, taking everything they could find, digging up new sites. And then they created the academy, in which they wanted to surpass what had been done by the Greeks and the Romans. They wanted to create pictures and statues of the human being that would bring the human being alive through art. And in architecture, they took the Bible of the Romans, Vitruvius's great work. And this building is in Cambridge, because it's quite extraordinary. They fell in love and idolized this dead world, and they found their own world ugly. The world that they had organically created, they found ugly. And so if they couldn't create a new building in the classical style, they would put a front on it. If you look there, that's a Gothic building with a classical front. They put classical fronts on the cathedrals because they found their own world that they created ugly. And then the Fire of London happened, which gave the opportunity to turn the central cathedral in London, St. Paul's Cathedral, into a temple, a classical temple. This is the Duke of Bedford, who was given a number of monastic properties. And here you have a site which you see very often in England, which is a classical building next to the ruin. It's built out of the ruin. And then, of course, what started to be built were the great palaces. And all over England you see the most incredible palaces. Because what had happened was that the saint had been replaced by the warrior statesman. Augustus Caesar had replaced St. Francis as the ideal. That's why when I was at school, because I was at a time when there was a revived religion. In the 19th century we saw a revived religion. We had Jesus Christ and Caesar. And these heroes, these warrior statesmen, were celebrated. Look at Nelson's column. You've all heard of Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. No one was put higher than him. When that was built, it was higher than anything in London. And the last of the warrior statesmen was Winston Churchill. He was the last one of that breed. And here they are celebrated, including Wolfe and all of the other heroes, Lord Nelson. And this new civilized world, classical, it was called classical. They called it classical art. What does it mean? Classic, perfect, perfection, the classical. That's what they called it. That's why they called it classical. And what they were looking at was not, they weren't engaging with the source, they were worshipping the product. The product, the art, the architecture, the literature of another civilization's production. They were dealing with the material product. And what were they looking at? Whereas in the Christian world, it was to create, the education there was to create a Christian man, a Christian scholar. Now they were educating a civilized man. And at the center of this new educational system were the Latin classics. The classics of Rome and the classics of Greece. This became the center of the curriculum of the Western universities. And you had two systems. Bible studies was now on a fringe. The classics were the major. The humanities, the human. This is all now to do with the human being. The focus was on the human. And this had a devastating effect upon the culture of England. Because what you had was you had a separation between religion and culture. There were two different worlds. And the culture was an elite culture. The ordinary people had no knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans and the mythologies and all the rest of it, and the Latin, and they didn't know anything about it. They weren't engaged in it. They had their reduced Christianity. So this division was the first of the great separations that took place. And now we have the third world, the modern world. Now, an extraordinary thing happened when the European stepped out of his own organic culture, the culture which he was contained within, and became an observer and looked at a world which he was outside of. And he became the observer. Because this had a very profound and a very devastating consequence. Because what happened is, he was looking at the past and this classical, this Greco-Roman dead world from the outside, but he also started to look at the whole natural world from the outside. The creation became something he was observing. He was no longer inside it. He had become an observer. A God's eye view. He'd become the center. Because he was looking at the material world as though it was just material. Measuring it, computing it, measuring that physical world. And what happened was that the deeper you go into materiality, the deeper you go into the physical world, the greater the forces are released. You start releasing powers. But those powers could not be realized until the new man of knowledge, the new way of looking at the world, what we call the scientific way of looking at the world, was married with that of the merchant. Because the merchant is also the person who deals with the material world. They deal with moving things around, taking crops from here to there, taking products from there to there, taking textiles from there to there. They are dealing with materiality. And that first marriage, you are looking there at Arkwright, the first billionaire, the man who created the spinning jenny. And we go from a world in which things are made mathematically in terms of addition. You make something, and then you make something else, to a world of multiplication. What is it? Multiplication. And you are now into something quite different. And this multiplication means that you are entering a machine space and a machine time and rhythm. The human rhythm, the human sense of space is being taken over by the machine. It's as though human beings start getting very, very long arms, hugely long feet so they can run very, very fast, eyes which can see very far. But all through the 19th century, this world that was beginning to form and beginning to grow was clothed in civilization. The culture of civilization remained. This is the great banquet of the guilds of London, very civilized. And the city of London was a very civilized Roman city. Mind you, if Julius Caesar had come and visited this city, he would have been very confused because he'd invented what he thought was a temple and found that it was a bank. But this is that world has been so. It was in America. It was in America that the modern culture broke through. And these are some of the founders of the new modern culture. New art, the art of advertising, industrial design. Because now, in the Christian, you are elevating people in order to carry them through to the spiritual meanings of things. Here, you're carrying people through to the wonderful things that they can have. And of course, and I must say, I visited your great temple. I had an amazing visit yesterday or the day before. The Twin Towers, that shopping mall. My goodness me, what a cathedral. Because these are the new cathedrals. These are the new cathedrals. But there is one great problem. We human beings cannot absorb all of this. We can't absorb it. That is a plastic lake the size of Texas in the Pacific. The size of Texas in the Pacific of plastic. But this new modern world has created a new way of life. It's a new way of life. And that new way of life is based upon work and leisure. Now, work is very monastic, very hard, very disciplined. Leisure is whatever you want it to be. If you want to just do football for the rest of your life, you can do football. You can watch television until your eyes drop out. You can go to pop concerts every weekend. That's your leisure. Paradise is not something that we long for after death. It's those 3 precious weeks when one is released from work and one can go to somewhere that is completely unspoilt and over a period spoil it. The whole world has been turned into a fun fair. You have to book to go up Everest now. You can go whitewater rafting, you can do anything. And nature is something that you go to look at. We are no longer a part of nature. Nature is now going into smaller and smaller reservations, which we go and we look at the creatures. We are alienated from them. And if we are of a cultural bent, we can go to museums and see any culture that you can imagine. We can go to any restaurant, and if we are of a religious disposition, we can go to church or we can go to the mosque, but this is a leisure activity. As long as it doesn't affect work. Work is serious. And of course, the machine has now created a framework that human beings now are completely connected outside. Take all the machines out, take all the machines away, put the young person in a room by themselves for 1 hour, and most will go crazy. You know, remove this, remove the, where is it? Remove this. It's incredible. The machine has made us outside. Inside, there's nobody home. The celebrities. The celebrities are now the heroes. And in our country, we've gone from the saint to the warrior, statesman, hero, to David Beckham. And at the center of this world, this modern culture, is the new financial district in the cities. And these new financial districts are huge, ever growing, and nobody knows what the dickens is going on in them. Finance has become so complicated, so strange, that even the people working in finance don't understand it. And this is New York. This is the old center. This is the center as it has always been for human beings, where the mosque or the cathedral or the synagogue is at the center. Now it's the financial district. And at the heart of this culture is the stock market. Because there's only one thing that counts in this modern world, culture, and that is, if it's going up, it's heaven. If it's going down, it's hell. Because everything, it depends. This is a material world. The modern world, culture, is material. And it has to grow in order to survive. So the only thing that you will find that is taken seriously by any government anywhere in the world is whether their economy is growing or not. And everything is sacrificed to that end. And of course, this culture has created its own educational system. And I've seen in Cambridge, over the last 30 years, Cambridge moving from a society, a university where the humanities, the classics were at the center, to being a university where the new modern education is at the center. And this new modern education, the center of it are two things: scientific innovation and entrepreneurship. Creating something new and then having the skill to be able to sell it. Because everything depends upon the human being consuming more. And we have now gone from being a Christian person to a civilized person to a consumer. We are now known as consumers. So, just to summarize, we have three quite separate cultures, civilizations, each with its own hierarchy, each with its own educational system, each with its own architectural world, and each with its own art. Now, my presentation goes on with two more short sections, because what's happened to modern art? So far, modern art hasn't appeared in this new modern world. But actually, the story of modern art is absolutely chilling, and it should worry all of you. It should really scare the life out of you. Because, you see, the Christian art was to raise people's spirits. The civilized art was an art in which glorified the human, the nobility of the human, the courage of the human, etc. And the modern art is the modern art of showing you what a wonderful car and how it will make you free, and you know, you can go anywhere and you can have your girlfriend in it and everything you like. But what happened to the modern artist? Well, something very interesting happened. Because you see, when they created the academies at the time of the Renaissance, our civilized period, the artist changed his position. And nothing can make this more clear than the term genius. Genius in the Christian time was a spirit, a familial spirit. It was a spirit which was outside of man. With the Renaissance, with the human, when everything comes to the human level, it comes inside the man and becomes a part of the man. You are a genius. So Michelangelo was a genius, which meant that the artist started to take on this special aura, and what the artist produced became something special. It had a kind of halo around it. So what of those artists who weren't craftsmen who were doing that, but who were from the academy and who had basically rebelled against the norms of the academy? Well, something very interesting happened. This is Picasso's Guernica. Instead of being at the center of society, which is what the artist traditionally always was, it was always carrying the central message, the modern artist went to the edge, became an outsider, and all that sensitivity started to pick up what was going on around him. So when Picasso heard about the bombing of his town of Guernica, because he was a Spanish, and the terrible carnage, he produced a painting of carnage. Pure carnage. There was no nobility, there was no heroism, nothing. It just showed the limbs broken and everything. And people at the time came and looked and said, that's all horrible. It's ugly. He said, of course it's horrible. It is horrible. Francis Bacon, this painting, by the way, was sold for $130,000. $130,000. Now, this artist was refused to go into the service at before the Second World War, because he wasn't well enough. So he volunteered to go in when the bombing took place in London, in the group which went in and pulled out the bodies. And he was and he was traumatized. And he was a man who was deeply perverted. He couldn't get up in the morning without having a drink. He was constantly drunk. And he was very perverted in other ways. And he is sharing with us his soul. It's horrifying. Everything is falling apart. The man is, everything is melting. And this is a friend of his that he's giving a portrait of. Jackson Pollock, a painter, he picked up on his radar chaos. He saw chaos everywhere, all around him, the chaos of the modern world. He saw it around him. And he took that chaos into his soul, and then he produced these paintings. This was sold for $170 million. And when he was 44, his life was such chaos, because the more chaos he took into his soul, the more chaos it became, that he was taking drugs and drink and everything else. He then got into a car with a girlfriend, etc. He had a lovely wife who tried to save him. And he drove at 100 miles an hour into a tree and was killed. And the society puts this into a museum and celebrates it. It's like a world saying, look at our chaos, isn't it beautiful? Madness, insanity. This one is showing how we are becoming robots. The modern person is becoming like a robot. We're back to our dear Tracy Amin, the Prime Minister's favorite artist, honored by Her Majesty the Queen. And she is a beautiful example of the Twitter generation, of the generation that believes that any thought they have, any idea, any emotional experience they have is worth sharing. Any dark idea they have, any dark emotion they have, they want to tell you about it. However shameful it is, it must be shared. This is a tent, and she's written on it the names of everybody she slept with. And it's in a museum. And now we come to the most chilling of all, Damien Hirst. Damien Hirst is the richest living artist that there has ever existed upon this earth. He's worth hundreds of millions of pounds. And this work, he was came from a Catholic working class Irish family, brought up in the north of England. He lost his faith when he was 11 because he had a very dysfunctional family, and he became an atheist. He didn't believe in God anymore, but he's obsessed with death. And all his art is about death without redemption. In other words, the atheist's death, the atheist's vision of death, where there's nothing other than this physical reality. And this particular work of art is the life cycle of the fly. In it is a calf's head. That's a real calf's head. Maggots form, flies fly around, and then they are zapped by this electrical zapper at the top. Death without redemption. Bleak and horrifying and profoundly ugly. So what you have is, with these 6 paintings, these artists are being honest. They're going right through all that lovely gloss of advertising and all that lovely plastic that we have and all that lovely wrapping papers and all the rest of it. They're seeing into the soul of modern man. And they're actually, they're sensitive people, you know. But they're giving a horrific message. So what does the society do? Well, the big problem is the artists fall in love with their creation. They love their creations. You know, the incredible thing about the human being is the human being can love ugliness. The human being can love perversity. The human being can fall in love with the most horrible things. And these artists, they love what they produce. And now you have a most horrible parody of Christianity. Because the artist who is the outsider, nobody understands. Nobody understands what they're doing. But they're like the Christ figure. They are the creator. And you need the critic, the high priest, to tell everybody what they're talking about, to interpret for them. So you can say, oh, yes, I understand. That's very interesting. That's amazing. Yes, I really like that. That's a wonderful thing, you know. And then you have the patrons. This was the sale of the Scream. $130 million it was sold for. The Scream by Edvard Munch. It's a horrifying painting. Man is in agony. And people think he's screaming. He's not screaming. He's covering his ears because he's standing on a bridge, and on one side is a slaughterhouse, and on the other side there's a lunatic asylum. And his sister happened to have been in a lunatic asylum. And he was hearing this noise. It's a horrible, terrible image. And then there's the moment when there is the great canonization of the artist with the one-man show. And this is the canonization of Damien Hirst. Death without redemption. And this exhibition was sponsored by the Qatar Foundation. And they bought the pills. He had 4 pieces of art like that, where he had these pills laid along a glass trays. And he called them spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Has no idea why. Anyway, the Qatar Foundation bought winter for $1 million. Death without redemption. And then they had the next show of Damien Hirst's work in Doha. How can you get to a stage where you believe that somehow art and what its content is are two different things? It's a very strange thing. And this was the centerpiece of his work. This is Damien Hirst. He had £50 million, so he spent £50 million on diamonds, took a skull, and covered it with diamonds. Death and money. What a beautiful example of our modern world. Death and money. And you've got to go back to the Renaissance. You've got to go back to this love affair with the dead. One of the extraordinary things. And just so that you can be in no doubt about this, this is the extension that they're building of Tate Modern, of the Tate Gallery. A building which is permanently in a state of disequilibrium, which is permanently falling down. It's telling you everything is falling down. And here we have all these other modern, and this one is being built in Abu Dhabi. Because you see, what's happened is extraordinary, is the artist, having been an outsider, looking and experiencing what's going on and expressing it, and telling the society horrible things, has been brought into the establishment and has become central to the establishment. So that what you've now got is you've now got a very frightening thing that has occurred. And that is the normalization of the abnormal. Because once the hierarchy, once the establishment recognizes and patronizes something, then everybody naturally will follow suit in time. And you will probably have noticed how that lovely car advertisement that I showed you before, with that lovely couple inside, it's not like what you see around you today. You see all these strange images, blurred, and something which is, very quick, everything is sort of, everything is, and the colors, and you watch the television. I can't watch it now because, everything's flickering around too much. So what is it doing? What is it doing? It is conditioning you to live in a world of chaos, acclimatize yourself to it, and end up enjoying it. So that what is normal looks abnormal, or it looks boring, or it looks dead. Whereas the reality is exactly the other. Islam, and I will go through this very quickly. Islam is one world. And this is the miracle of the Holy Quran, because the Holy Quran produced a complete revelation, a blueprint which covered the whole of life. And it was delivered through a prophet, a beloved prophet, who embodied that wholeness, and who had 23 years with companions, 13 years in Mecca when they were under siege, and 10 years in Medina where they were in charge. And that experience meant that hundreds of companions were fully imbued and fully educated in that whole deen. Now, the scholar in Christianity, this is the scholar saint. This is the religious. This is the part where you have your Christian world. With Islam, that is one quadrant, because the warrior saint, the warrior statesman, which is the second of the Western world, the civilized world, is integrated, as is the merchant. The beautiful thing about Islam is the balance, because all these three powerful ways of life, which in the West reveal themselves one after another, and each one became extreme, with Islam you had the perfect balance between them. And you had the perfect balance between city, nomad, and village. And the craftsman was completely at home in Islam. There was never a rebellion. It manifested the society right through. The inner and the outer. Beautiful thing about the Islamic city. The inside is rich. The outside is simple. And the organic nature. The Islamic city is like a honeycomb. Unity through calligraphy and geometric pattern. And then what unfolded from Mecca and Medina was this incredible world of Dar al-Islam. And wherever Islam went, it connected into the culture of the area, into the environment of the area. You had a perfect balance between unity and diversity. And of course, everything connected up through the direction to Mecca and the Kaaba. Now, Dar al-Islam faced three challenges from the West. The first was the Christian West, and that came in the form of the Crusades. And within 100 years or so, the Crusades left, and it was re-established under Islam. And indeed, during that period, Islam spread, and the Byzantine world was conquered, and Istanbul became a great center of Islam. But the second challenge, the civilized West, was a different matter. Because here was the moment of real devastation culturally. Firstly, you have the great warrior statesman, epitomized by Napoleon, and all the European powers developing their military and their seamanship and creating their Roman empires. And the first thing they did when they arrived in a country was to get out their bucket and spade. The Egyptians thought they were crazy. They arrived in Egypt and they started digging up, getting their buckets and spades and digging away, and the Egyptians were looking at them and saying, now we know, these people are completely crazy. The only reason you dig up those old tombs and things is to get the treasure out of them. But these people were digging them up and taking all these things and brushing them off and then creating these mausoleums, these incredible mausoleums, and putting them in these cases and going and incredible. Everywhere the Europeans went, they engaged with the people, and then all their artifacts went into the museum. They killed them. They killed every culture. And this left Dar al-Islam completely in a situation where they had no resistance to the next onslaught when the modern culture emerged. Work of art, chaos calligraphy. You see it everywhere now. Calligraphy, I'm an artist. A traditional calligrapher who spends 10 years learning to do calligraphy. An artist comes along and takes maybe £100,000. I'm an artist. Where do they get this from? This is a famous Muslim artist of India. He's a millionaire, multi-millionaire. He's got a foundation. It's bullseye. This is Abu Dhabi after the F1. Their big celebration after the F1. Martians have landed. There's nothing that connects this city of Doha with the culture. I was in Mecca at the Haram in the early 1980s, and I was moved to ask, they had the water carriers who had these wonderful urns which are shaped like that, and you put them in the sand. They had the Zamzam water. You put them in the sand, and they keep the water completely cool because the water evaporates. And of course, at the end of their life, they break and they go back into the earth. They're made locally, and for generations. The Prophet Abraham, going right back, they would have had the same thing. And I was moved. I wanted it. So I asked a friend, please, can you go and ask him if I can have it? So I got it, and I brought it back to my home, and I put it in the corner of my bedroom, the Qibla corner. The next time I went to Mecca, so to conclude, we have three completely separate worlds coming from the West, each one becoming extreme. Extreme spirituality, and then the last one, extreme materiality. The extreme materiality is based upon material growth, and it has to grow to survive. And that growth now is reaching into the very depths of the earth. It's engaging every corner of the earth in order to be able to sustain itself. Islam produced a world that was completely in balance. The mizan, completely in balance. But those traditional forms have been replaced. But the center remains intact. The center and the vast tradition of Islam. Books which haven't even been opened because they don't seem to be irrelevant. But now we are facing a time when everyone can experience that the world is out of balance. It's in a state of complete disequilibrium. So if you want to bring it back into balance, where do you go? You go to seek the knowledge from those who have practiced mizan. And that, par excellence, is exactly what the Muslim generations and Muslim culture has manifested for 1400 years, from West Africa through to China. Thank you very much indeed. Assalamu alaikum.